Welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Join me in welcoming author, columnist, teacher, healer, and ritual leader, Lawrence Messerman, as he talks with us about the power of ritual in facing our challenging predicaments. Lawrence Messerman. There's been so much loss. If we do not shed tears, if we do not honor these great losses, we may displace the grief into rage and self-righteousness, or we may simply become deadened. A good part of the disconnection that is characteristic of modern life is because we have not properly grieved. Those who come from more intact traditional cultures can see this in modern Western people. Burdened by unexpressed grief, a deadened people can only wreak more death and destruction. This was certainly part of the dynamic when European peoples came to the New World. Their own cultures had been going through centuries of war, famine, disease, and collective trauma. And when they set foot in Africa, the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand, they wrought further death and destruction on the native peoples and the lands they inhabited. Trauma begets more trauma. The cycle needs to stop if there's any hope of surviving into the future. So strong and prophetic words and a brilliant context for the conversation that we'll be having today with Lawrence Messerman. And Larry, it's just a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to meet you. And I know we're going to need to get to an introduction. Hopefully you'll do a quality self-introduction here at some point soon. But I'm wondering if those words, if those couple of paragraphs from your recent article in resilience.org, feeling resilient in tumultuous times, I'm wondering if you're sparked to add or, to add anything as we begin the conversation today.
Well, thanks, Dean, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And I think all I'll say about that right now is that it's not really original thinking. Many people, I feel, are coming to a similar conclusion. And I think I probably was most moved first by the words of Malidoma Somé. I don't know if you know of Malidoma. He's a shaman in the Dagara tradition from what's now Burkina Faso in West Africa. And in Malidoma's first book, he talks about coming to the West and how he could just feel that Westerners were just so burdened by grief. I mean, it shocked him. Mm-hmm. And this is something that a lot of traditional people see in the West, that even though we seem to have so much materialistically, that emotionally we're burdened, wounded, and not really present. And so, this is something that I believe really is part of the predicament that we're in right now in terms of not being able to live sustainably. Mm-hmm. And it's something that needs to be addressed in order to move forward.
Yeah. Well, I absolutely hear you and have done quite a bit of study around the work of Malidoma Somé, but even more so around one of his good buddies, Francis Weller, here on the West Coast. Uh-huh. And So I appreciate what you're saying, and absolutely agree that one of the large holes in the container, the cultural container that we live in, is the unmetabolized grief, the completely unaddressed grief that is at the foundation of our culture. Larry, would you say a little bit about what got you to this place where you're writing this kind of article for Resilience and elsewhere, and what kind of work do you do?
Sure, I'll say a little bit. First of all, I'm executive director of an organization called Sacred Fire. And the motto for the organization is discover what's been forgotten. And an easy way, I guess, to explain the organization is to say that we've come to understand something that our ancestors have known since the beginning, which is fire is the energy of heart. And we see that the basic problem with the modern world is that we've become very much obsessed with our minds. Mm. And instead of mind and heart working together, we live very much in our heads. And so heart is, or fire, known in most traditions as the energy of heart. Heart is the energy or the faculty that connects us to the world. So the fact that we're doing so much to destroy the environment, the fact that we live in isolation, the fact that we no longer have connections, many of us, with our ancestral traditions, is because of a lack of heart. So Sacred Fire is an international organization that literally hosts community fires, an opportunity for people to sit in a supportive setting. We make offerings to the fire in the Huichol tradition, which we've been authorized to do. It's a tradition from Mexico. And it really helps to bring people into heart space and to feel that connection again. So that's one of my hats. And then connected to that, it's how I got into this work, is that I received a calling to be what's called a Marakame, a traditional healer or ritual leader in the Huichol tradition. And so I do healing work as a Marakame.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's an extraordinary set of attributes that I wouldn't expect from your detailed bio on your website, tendingfire.com. I'm curious if you could just give us a couple of little vignettes of what drew you to those particular lineages and how that shows up now in the calling of these particular times. It seems like that's an extraordinary kind of toolbox that you've put together of, ways of being in the world and ways of perhaps being of service to others. Can you say anything about how it was that you kind of got into that lineage?
Yeah, it's a bit of a story, and I think I do write about it a little bit on the website, but basically, it's not something I went looking for. I had a sense of, wanting to be of service, being concerned about world events, but frankly, I thought my path was to be an academic, and I ended up getting a PhD in education with an organizational development focus. And I always thought that, the university was the ivory tower. It's, free exchange of ideas. It's where, the future is made, or at least thought about. And then somewhere along the way, I was actually in graduate school with my wife. We were both working on PhDs, and she's the more sensible of the two of us, I have to say. And she suggested we do something like meditation. So we started doing transcendental meditation. And things really started shifting. We started getting interested in healing and, you know, channeling and this and that. And then I stumbled across somebody called Elliot Cowan and a book called Plant Spirit Medicine. And I found out we were living in Santa Barbara, California, and coincidentally, and a lot of things happen coincidentally like this, he was moving back from Mexico and had just relocated to Santa Barbara. So we went to hear him speak, and I was expecting some kind of exotic looking shamanic guy, you know, but he looked very, you know, I like to joke, he looked like kind of a shoe salesman from Chicago, which is where he was raised. You know, he's kind of like balding and kind of owly glasses, and but the way he spoke was what really got me. And now it's what I would call a heart voice. And he said something like, what do you say about a culture? And mind you, this was 20 years ago. He said, what do you say about a culture where the young people feel such a lack of hope that they take their lives? And he said, in a traditional culture that's intact, that's shocking. Now, of course, in a lot of native cultures, they're so decimated by Western, you know, the violence, the oppression, all the things we mean, the marginalization, it's very common. But in a traditional Western culture, they would, traditional culture, they would say, the young people have all the promise. You know, there would be no reason to take your life. And then he began to talk about the world being fundamentally out of balance, you know. And so, you know, listening to those words, it was like I didn't quite understand what he was saying, but I knew at a deeper level that he was speaking the truth. And I signed up for Plant Spirit Medicine and hadn't even started the course, but once I signed up for it, I started having the strange dreams that led me to my calling on the shamanic path. So the short answer is it's something that showed up. It's not something that I looked for.
Mm-hmm. Got it. You know, you kind of went right to what is the center of this writing project that I'm in the middle of right now, this second book, in which I'm just at the next level of answering the deceptively simple question of what got us into these predicaments. And the answer always comes back as some iteration or another of we've disconnected. Mm-hmm. We've disconnected from deeper self, from other people, from earth, and from our own soul. Yeah. Says this body of work, my way of putting it together in shorthand. Mm-hmm. And I heard a bit of that in your response, and especially with regard to that situation that you were describing of, you know, what if we have a culture that has its young people committing suicide? I think you and I both know that that's just one of countless warning flags that are going on now in our global culture, but primarily with the USA at leading the pack in every conceivable negative way. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you have any way of describing that or holding that realization that you'd like to share with us.
Sure. I think one perspective that I've been shown, which might be a little bit different from what you've encountered, is that actually this is an age-old problem that's been with us since the beginning. Because as soon as we were given minds, we had the tendency to feel separation. mean, there are other people who are saying this. But it's, people look at the economic system and capitalism and science and technology, and those are certainly, issues like patriarchy. They're all aspects of this disconnection. But what we've been told is that actually from the very beginning of us becoming human, as opposed to just, primates, we were given minds, and the understanding was that with minds comes that very possibility of feeling disconnection and separation. And we see this in a lot of the traditional stories. In fact, I was thinking recently of the story of the Garden of Eden. This is like apocryphal in that way. And it shows, and it is in a particular tradition, and there may be some patriarchal overlay to it, some revisionism, let's say. But, the fact that Adam and Eve lived in this blissful state where they were in connection with nature, they lived in Eden. And it was taking from the tree of knowledge. That was the one thing that was, quote unquote, prohibited in the story. In my understanding, it's just part of human development. But it was the act of knowing, and actually we say, in my tradition, it's not knowing but understanding, because knowing is more from the heart, whereas understanding is from up here. But the need to have to understand the world was the act that cast us out of the garden. And that's because it's built into the faculty of the mind to separate. That's part of its gift, but it's part of the peril. And so the way I've heard the story, the gods who set all of this in motion, and this is more from the shamanic perspective, they knew that that was going to be a problem, and it was at that time that we were given fire and the traditions to help us stay connected to heart. So fire was actually the first teacher. Fire was the source of all the original spiritual traditions. And all those traditions had practices that enabled people to still feel connection to the great web of creation. But the problem is that over time, and it was very, very gradual in the beginning, but humans have this innate tendency to forget, and they get more and more into their heads. And of course, that gets accelerated, with modern times and the Industrial Revolution and where we find ourselves now. And so now we're just so far out of balance that we see a lot of the problems we encounter these days, which again, we would trace to not being sufficiently in heart space. So in a nutshell, that's, and part of it too is that the traditions have changed too. So the original traditions were very much about practices, but now it's become much more about dogma, which is really more of a mind issue than a heart issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm wondering if we could just shift gears slightly to, I don't know the actual nature of your work, and I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit. It's fairly obvious that at the center of your work is the relationship with the fire, sitting in circle at the fire, and so on, and all of that container can bring in relatedness.
Yeah,
I get that. I'm wondering if there are other iterations that don't necessarily need to be outside with the fire, in that kind of a setting,
sure.
Given that that's kind of an unusual setting for many, many people. but it sounds like you do an awful lot of work with people who still very much need the kind of connectedness that you're pointing to,
Mhm.
but might not have access to that particular form. Can you describe how the work can shift
Mhm.
and still hold some power?
Yes, and and Sacred Fire. I mean, we do offer the community fires. We have other programs. We have a program called Lifeways, which is helping people live according to the cycles of life. And that includes programs of initiation, retreats for adults, but it is also very much experiential. Um, and we're realizing that we need to do more, probably more online, because that's an easy way to reach people like you and I are speaking today. And even though we really understand that the best thing is for people to be together, you and I can have a certain connection here because we're talking, we're on video, that helps. It's better than email or texting, certainly. But there's something very different about sitting together. When we're together, you really feel a person's presence. And so we always like to encourage that. But of course, the way we're scattered across the world and the limitations people have, I would say anything that helps you get into heart space. And there's a lot out there now. It's not like we've invented this. This is like the oldest medicine that's known really in pretty much all traditions. But things like yoga, meditation, mindfulness practice, anything that helps to calm the mind is helpful in this regard. And also spending time in nature. And nature, not just as a backdrop for activity. You and I were talking about the fact that we've both lived in Oregon, and I came from Bend before moving here to Georgia. And Bend's a wonderful place, and a lot of people are connected to nature, but it's really nature as recreation, which is okay. But I'm talking about nature like a place to go, to contemplate, to be quiet, to be open, because it's our understanding that, in fact, the natural world is alive and full of spirit. And that once you begin to open that to that, you begin to experience more of this kind of heart connection. And in fact, it's opening to that allows for the wisdom of how to live in a good way to kind of start percolating up, literally, from the land. So any practice that calms the mind, that gets you in nature, is a good practice.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sorry, I've forgotten which article I had read, or darn it, I believe it was some description of you're doing some conflict resolution or some way of finding a good way for people to be relating that had been strained, and that's as best as I can recall. I'm sorry, I don't remember the article and so on.
That's okay.
I'm curious if, because what you just brought up a couple of moments ago was, what I might call self-regulation, self-regulating our systems, self-soothing our systems, bringing ourselves to a different kind of organ of perception in our body and our system is what I hear you describing. And, I'm completely with you on that being such an essential skill and a, a, an essential orientation in life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you could give us just a small sense of when you've got two people who are as immersed in this business as usual, heady world that we all call normal, and they're calling out. They're asking, we need some help here.
Yeah.
We don't know how to relate better. It's obviously not working. We're in pain. Can you help? Could you just give us a bit of a sense of how you could start to orient them to those other organs of perception, primarily the heart?
Well, the easiest way, the primary way, is in the emotions. You know, the mind works with thoughts and abstractions, but the heart works with feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So this is connected to that issue of grief, of course, is like, how do we deal with where we're at, you know, collectively or individually if we don't feel?
Yeah.
Yes, we can talk about the numbers and the data and you know, all that, but to really face it and to really move in a good way, we have to feel it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, even in conflict resolution, you could have two very polarized individuals, but what's important is to move them into the feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And once you do that, and if you can hold that space in a good way and allow them to express what they need to express, they naturally begin to see their common humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And they can usually find a point of agreement, even if they may not completely agree. Because in the end, what's not so important are the positions and the posturing, but the feeling. And at the core, you know, our understanding is we're all pretty much alike. We have the same concerns, even though, you know, liberal people may express them in a certain way and conservative people in another way. We have common concerns. And you can really get to that through the feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, in the name of that, uh, I have a regular practice, and I'd like to ask you to join me, if you will, in any part of it. It's that usually around midday, if I'm noticing my energy is flagging, and particularly if I'm feeling very little, and I'm finding myself ruminating and really caught in
Yeah.
this ruminating loop. I like to make a point of accessing a far more expansive and a far more embodied state that
Mm,
does include the emotional realm
mm,
and others.
mm,
And oftentimes, really all I need to do these days to do that is to become present to what is so in the moment, no matter what it is. And that's been a long road to hoe for me. It's not like that just came on and I all of a sudden had that skill. It's been hard won
yeah.
for this monkey-minded guy over here.
Me too. I have that
Um,
too.
and another way that uh, I can bring myself back to a better state is I can become more present to something that I truly love about being alive, something that I hold in my heart in a precious way.
Beautiful.
And I'm doing that right now. I'm a ocean guy.
Mm,
And all
mm,
I need to do is bring in some
yeah.
of my allies and some of my sweet comrades from the ocean world, and the shift happens pretty quickly.
Mm, wonderful.
And sometimes when that's going on, I also, kind of get an impress in my system of what's going on in the
Mm,
oceans, which I think you and I both know. There's a tremendous amount of tragedy going on in
yes.
the oceans.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you would be willing to share with us how you bring yourself back to, the state that you're looking for, you're desiring, and also what are some of the elements that you most love about life that you use as a touchstone to be more present.
Mm. Well, I think for me, it really is the fire. Right now, just beyond my screen, I have a candle going, so that's often, even if I'm indoors, if I want to feel connected to that more expansive heart space, just that little reminder of a candle helps, which is something everybody can do. I have a daily prayer practice that I do in the mornings and the evenings. And like you mentioned, one aspect of that is a big aspect is gratitude. Just giving thanks for all the life that supports me, and of course, when I have the opportunity, and I'm living in a fairly rural, small town kind of area right now, to be outside and to be breathing the air and just noticing the change in the seasons. For me, especially in the morning when I first wake up, it's a good practice to just take a little time, maybe a cup of tea or coffee, and just sit connecting with nature. It's just a good way to start the day because despite the nature of my work, or maybe it's just a tribute of the times, I have to spend a lot of time like this on the computer, on the phone. And so to start the day with some connection to nature, I find very helpful. And I do miss being on the West Coast and seeing the ocean because I love to go and sit by the ocean. And in fact, used to have fires by the ocean, which was quite nice. So things like that really help me. And, I think going to the last question you asked about what I'm grateful for is that um, as dire as things look, and in fact they are very dire in many ways, and you and I both, I think, agree that the trends are, well, that we're in for probably even bigger challenges in the future. As dire as that looks, the perspective that I've been given, which has been quite helpful for me, is that there's a bigger game going on here. And it's in fact a divine game. And that we've been through not exactly this before, but we've been through cycles of this before. Because, again, humans have this tendency to forget. And there's a lot of stories, old stories, of floods, of Eden being the first, being cast out of a feeling of oneness and connection. But there are a lot of ancient stories, sacred stories, that talk about these cycles of deep forgetting, imbalance, destruction, etc. And what gives me great hope is that actually the traditions are being connected to again. The fact that I, from a fairly conventional American background, received a calling in a tradition that goes back thousands of years. This is something that's beginning to percolate up from the destruction, the concrete that's breaking from our modern Western ways, and it's going to help us find our way in the future. So I don't think it's going to be an easy ride. I think it's certainly legitimate and necessary to feel the anger and the sadness, the grief about it. But I feel great trust that there are greater powers at work than our minds and our intentions. And that's where the hope lies for me.
That's interesting. I have such a a very mixed reaction to the word hope.
Uh-huh.
Um, I find it the vast majority of time that it's used is it indicates that it indicates a future orientation that a person is declining to be present and
Yeah.
instead superimposing some wishful
Right.
thinking toward an imaginary future,
Yeah. Yeah.
taking more and more of their presence from the moment. And that includes having them not feel what's true and present in the moment as well. So I'm curious if you wouldn't mind, I would appreciate it if you could help us, kind of unpack that a little bit, because clearly you're using hope in a very different way than what I'm describing.
Yeah.
Um, I've got to say that I can hear you,
Mhm.
that and I believe I'm agreeing that I don't know. I'm
Mhm.
very clear. I don't know what's happening in the future,
Mhm.
but at the same time, I'm starved for anything other than really harsh news
Yeah.
from every direction that I've been now, just as a lay person, I've been researching for years on end now for these books, and I have yet to be substantially encouraged in
Yeah.
any way.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear you unpack it a little bit more. And it sounds like you might actually have input that is non-human, perhaps, and particularly refreshing might be non-linear and not encased in the trappings of our culture. So if you don't mind saying a bit more about what you were saying before and
Yeah.
the hope that it has you feel.
Yeah, and I actually appreciate you catching me on that because my guidance actually is, well, hope is a bad word. It's more like trust.
Mm-hmm.
As hope is very much, Pollyannish, it's like, oh, I don't have evidence, but I just somehow think things are going to work out. What I mean is more like trust, because I've seen so many times things that there's just no physical explanation for. There's no Western scientific explanation for the healing work that I do, for the healing work that my elders do, for the guidance I receive. The Sacred Fire organization, Sacred Fire Community, is one of three organizations. There's Sacred Fire Foundation and Blue Deer Center up in New York. And all three were founded by fire. It's literally the fire speaking to us and guiding us to do these things. So the divine help is not some kind of remote, oh, I just think something's going to work out, but it's there in very tangible ways. And this is not something like, well, we're special people and we've got some kind of special guidance. No, it's when you're in heart space, when you're and this is true of mystics of many traditions, it's true of a lot of the indigenous traditions.
Mm-hmm.
People still hear the voices of the gods.
Mm-hmm.
We have many traditional cultures. I'm thinking like the Achuar of Ecuador, who came out. They had very little contact with the West, um, and they began speaking. Lynn Twist, who formed Pachamama Alliance,
Mm-hmm.
literally started having dreams of these people. Now, she was already doing some great work with her Hunger Project, but she had no clue what this was about. And I think it was John Perkins helped her connect. Um, so there are people literally coming out of the forest saying, we know you people are in trouble. We've seen what you're doing to the world, not only our immediate environment, but we know you're threatening life itself. And we have something to offer you.
Yeah.
So that's quite astounding. That's quite remarkable. And I'm seeing around the world, there are rituals that are being done again for the first time in a long time that are again about doing that deep listening. Because, the world knows how to run itself, to put it in kind of a crass way. We humans are the ones who get in the way.
Mhm.
And the rituals that have been lost, but many are being recovered, helps us to support that process, to align ourselves with that, versus getting in the way and causing the havoc and the destruction that we're causing now.
Mhm.
So that gives me great trust. And I don't know, are we going to survive as a species? My hunch is yes. But I see that there are forces, I said this before, much greater than ours at work. And what seems hopeless can suddenly turn around into something quite miraculous.
Mhm.
Now, I want to be careful with that, because the human side of me, still, I read the news and I'm troubled by what I see. And I'm concerned about uh, what the process may look like, because even from a very conventional perspective, and I think there's some wisdom to that, I think it's pretty clear that the planet cannot sustain the number of people that we have right now.
Mhm.
So how is that balance going to be reachieved, and how much suffering is going to happen in the process?
Mhm.
That concerns me very deeply,
Mhm.
as I think it does you too.
Yeah.
And so even though I have this trust on the one side, it doesn't preclude and shouldn't preclude um, feeling very deeply for the predicament that we're in.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a dance and a paradox, and it's like you have to. I think if you're to really be honest, be human, and be present, it's like you can't help but dance with the grief and the anger and fear. Which I think I also talked about in the resilience article. That's going to be the huge issue, because fear is the emotion that's actually very much behind the predicament that we're in.
Mhm.
And there will be some legitimate reasons, as the world's changing, as the environment is declining, as social and political polarity seems to be increasing, there's some legitimate reasons for being afraid. But fear run amok will not lead us in the right direction. So that's something we really need to look at, and how to, yes, you feel the fear like any emotion, but when it runs the show, well, you get the kind of world that we live in right now.
Yeah, I agree, and I just want to go back to what you laid out so clearly. You reorienting from the word we were originally using, which was hope, and bringing it over to more of a trust. And I appreciate that distinction. I noticed that for myself, having my own particular uh, access to messages, if you will, from other dimensions and other organs of perception, I I noticed that one thing that helps to free me up from the rumination that can happen, and the eddying, the emotional eddying that I can get into, and I think the culture even more so can get into, of fear. Another word I would uh, bring up is shame. I think we are barely touching the edge of a tsunami of shame that will be coming on once we know that we've gone past the tipping points. But that's a whole nother conversation for a later day. Um, I'm noticing for myself what helps me stay present and as available in that state that you and I are keep pointing to as possible is the more I can release the collective image or dream, if you will, that we put together, the story we tell ourselves about what it is we're about, how we create meaning for ourselves, where we have forfeited our authentic sense of meaning and connection with the world. So that illusory kind of veneer of meaning that we put over ourselves is that we've created the most intelligent, most fantastic structure that life could ever want to have. We are clearly, it's human supremacy over every other life form, and so on and so on. Yeah. And so the more I can kind of peel away that sticky image that wants to be plastered on literally every surface, the more I can find what I think you're talking about when you use the word trust. I know, even though we don't know each other well, I know you well enough to know that you're not talking about trusting that sticky veneer of what we would like to think about ourselves, that this is really how great we think we are, and so on. And the continuity of that sticky veneer. What I hear you pointing to with your mentioning of trust seems to be trusting that which is there when we peel away that sticky veneer. Which really has nothing to do with the number of or even the existence of human beings in a future. It's certainly above my pay grade spiritually to know whether it will include people or not. I don't know.
Mine too.
And the more I can release that and just breathe with that uncertainty, and that uncertainty, instead of being the thing that we are most terrified of in this culture, that uncertainty, instead it can be something of a wash of grace in trusting the unknown, trusting the mystery, really honoring the mystery. Is that on track with anything you were sharing?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And I guess, I mean, look, the fact is we all have an expiration date. We're all going to die. There's no question about that. We know that. So of course, I mean, I hope the species survives. I hope there's a future. But everybody's going to die no matter what. So, on some level, this is a question of like, how do you live in a good way? I mean, yes, I can feel the grief of the possibility of extinction, anger, whatever about that fear. But I think that state of grace that you're talking about is realizing that the game is, no matter what, that uncertainty, that future that we can't really know, to try and live in a good way, the best way we can. We're going to be on a wild ride. No question, we are already. So what can we do to help each other? However long the ride is, and that's true for every individual as it is for us collectively. And what I've found is that, getting beyond what you call that sticky veneer, which I see as a product of the mind, our concepts of who we are as humans, the hubris that we have, the arrogance about our modern ways. people of the past, like the modern view is, oh, they were just childlike, they were superstitious, they didn't know better. Well, the margins of error in the past were much, much less than they are now. You know, people did not have a lot of technology to mediate their safety, but they believed these things because they knew them to be true. You know, they didn't engage in rituals because they were childlike and didn't know any better. They found that the rituals, which in fact were given to them, helped them to live in a good way for thousands of years. And you know, we forget that our modern way of life, one way it was put to me, it's like if human history was graphed onto an 80-year-old lifespan, modern times would be the last 15 minutes. Now we think that 15 minutes is it, like that's like the most important thing, that's the pinnacle. But that's a very skewed way. It's like for eons and eons, our people lived in a different way, and they survived. And they survived with a lot less than we did. Superstition? No, it wasn't superstition. They knew how to live in a good way.
Mm.
Now, there were variations, and some cultures were better than others, but all the ancient stories point to very similar beginnings and very similar wisdom in terms of things like humility, you know, which I think is the flip side of that sticky, arrogant perception that we have these days. Being humble, being open, engaging in rituals that help life continue in a good way, meeting around the fire, being in community, you know, feeling life instead of thinking about it. Well, life continued pretty well for a long time.
Yeah. I've got a good buddy that is an anthropologist and so much more, an academic par excellence, and he's been in the field a lot as well. And I just love it when he'll tell me stories of the west coast of the North American continent, where he's done a lot of research of all the various groupings of human beings for the past roughly 15,000 years. And you know, he can tell extraordinary stories from the middens that he's dug through and so on, that basically tell a story of hundreds and hundreds of different tribes and groupings that lived in peace and actually did remarkably little travel. You know, a little bit of commerce or exchange here and there, extraordinarily little evidence of any violence of any kind. It's an exquisite contrast to what certainly I was taught growing up, is that human beings have always been a warring and almost murderous bunch, no matter where we go. I love having some sort of contrast, some sort of comparison that knocks that off of its, you know, central location in our view. You know, I have a feeling that we could definitely keep going and find a few threads that our two bodies of work could blend very, very well in conversation. So I hope that this is not our last chance to have conversation. It's been an extraordinary introduction to get a sense of someone from one very distinct and prominent culture in our world, as you are, having really been invited into different lineages and come up with a body of work that where you have landed. It's interesting. I'm not sure which brand of hope I'm talking about right now, but it gives me some kind of hope. You are an unusual blend of different influences, Larry Messerman, and I so appreciate getting this chance to meet you, and still am very inspired by your brief article, Feeling Resilient in Tumultuous Times, in resilience.org, and I'll be putting that link in the show notes for today's conversation. One thing I'd like to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, just one last thing as you're signing off. If you could imagine us having a far larger voice than this small podcast, if you had a chance to speak to a far larger chunk of humanity, if you would just like to offer a far larger group of people a message from your heart to theirs, what would you say?
Well, I would say, I think what I spoke earlier, that the world is alive. And in fact, it wants to support us. And it's available to support us. And if we can simply slow down and disconnect and become unplugged and begin to listen better, we can begin to feel that. And there's a lot of wisdom that's available to us for how to live in a good way and to make it through these tumultuous times. But we just have to slow down and listen. It's as basic as that. And, I really appreciate having this opportunity to talk with you, and thank you for your kind words. And I do hope that we get a chance to talk again in the future.
All right. Larry Messerman, thank you so much for spending time with us on the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I sure wish you well. And maybe, just maybe, there'll be a chance for me to come out to wherever it is that you're leading a fire this coming year and to sit in circle with you. I would really appreciate that.
Would love that. Thanks very much, Dean, and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Subscribe to the Poetry of Predicament podcast while you're here, and join us in our bi-weekly Safe Circle calls by signing up on the website www.livingresilience.net.